What is up, Rad Potential YouTube? Welcome to today's video. Engine in car turnover with good bearings. That's goal for the video. So I was showing Calvin last night something that was interesting as I've been taking more projects apart in my garage because I have a bigger shop here than my one car garage. It's interesting to see where the parts from vehicles go. So we've got an entire rally car drivetrain here, front spindles, header, trans, engine, axle, radiator, the broken diff from my rally car. And then this small pile is the rotary truck engine, all the stuff that goes in the engine bay of the rotary truck. It's crazy just how little things come out of the rotary truck, or at least even the RADX7 here, which I'll show you. And what's left of my RADX7 pile, I knocked my nice fender cover blanket off, but intake manifold, oil cooler lines, radiator intercooler pipes. The oil cooler, I am going to grab one of my other spares, so we'll be taking my fittings off of this one. I'm curious if I can have this one like hot tanked and cleaned, so I'm not going to throw it away. The fan, we won't need the fan anymore. And then moving back here, I guess Charles's rotary truck radiator, but my sweet little brace and my engine mount. It's amazing how simple these cars are in realizing, like, you know, this week, what all have we done here? Monday, I took apart the rotary truck. Tuesday morning, we stripped it down to bare metal, I think. That evening, and got the rest of the engine stuff cleaned for this, and then got this engine stacked up the other night, and then the next day, we're putting it in the car, and it's going to be back in the car. Because literally 2.5 weeks ago, this thing decided to lose all of its oil on the road and burnt the motor up. So in 2.5 weeks, we've taken this apart and put it back together, raced a rally. It's crazy all the stuff we've gotten done on the channel. So I'm going to drop this thing in there. If you've never seen under the hood of this deal, I'll show you, and you guys will see here as we go. Everything's all painted in here. IGN 1A ignition coils, my harness for the fuel tech. That's an RX-8 6-speed. I've got the Re-Speed rack and pinion stuff in here. Overall, a super simple first generation RX-7. Rear is still the stock 4-link with a Watts link, Racing Beat sway bars front and back. Really, turbo 2 brakes is a pretty simple setup. So if you have more questions about this, drop it in the comments below. I can answer them. Or go check out the whole build of the entire car from last year on the channel. So let's drop this whole turbo 2 back into the engine bay and hopefully get this thing fired up so that it is now all back in one piece, ready to go for the dyno. We can wash it and then start on the 4-rotor project in the next video. Sometimes you just gotta jump in there and get it right into the trans. Now I gotta get out without scratching my paint or Calvin's gonna be mad at me. Ooh. Didn't know you had to be acrobatic to work on RX-7's, huh? This right here is the straw that broke the camel's back. Or I guess we'll say the RADX7's back. And it is back because I made a new oil cooler line. So my car has a remote oil filter that's mounted to the frame rail, basically right across from where all the spark plugs and stuff are at on the engine. Reason for that is when you switch to the RX-8 transmission, you can no longer fit the oil filter pedestal on like an early 13B and REW. You've got to do some finagling to get the clutch slave cylinder to work. Now, there's a lot of options for that. You can run a Honda B-Series clutch slave cylinder. You can run some washers under the RX-8 one. You can put a block off on, like my car has, a little Racing Beat oil filter pedestal block off and run a remote filter. So that's what I opted to do. The reason I like the remote filter thing is that I've got my filter mounted such that it unscrews and it comes down vertically. So when you prime the filter with oil, when you change your oil filter, there's nothing for it to leak on. The stock Mazda location for the filter is like on top of the back of the engine. So when you take the filter off, inevitably, it makes a mess. So I just wanted to eliminate both of those things. No mess, easier to change. In addition, it's a GM big giant filter. So there's plenty of room to catch all the metal shavings that ideally we don't shove through our engine because I got this nice new oil cooler line. So all the new oil cooler lines for the car are all Vibrant Performance real nice aluminum AN style stuff where you like put this back collar on and then this new collar threads into here. I've opted for the swivel fittings so this stuff all moves around. You know, spend a little more money than the like push lock style with the little clamps on them. That's what I had before. I smoked the bearings in my rotary engine. Not quite the same as like hurting a Steve Morris SMX big block that's probably 100 grand. So I don't really need like crimped fancy fittings just yet. If I blow one of these up, you can bet we're going to be getting crimped lines made. The new oil cooler line is installed. I've got all my wiring hooked up, fuel lines hooked up, spark plug wires hooked up, got the turbo manifold on, and I want to show you guys how I've laid this out, hopefully to inspire you guys maybe to not be as intimidated for building like a standalone harness or really building and wiring and plumbing and doing your whole car. What I did when I built my car last year is I used some DEI Velcro heat wrap on both of my fuel lines. So my fuel return here and my fuel primary feed there. What that does is it keeps those isolated from the heat of the engine, but also keeps it organized down here for if you need to service your car. This other section of DEI heat wrap is for my wiring harness. This is not intended to so much protect the entirety of the harness as I have the loom for that reason, but it organizes all of my wires into this nice grouped up bunch that goes to the engine to connect everything. So you have fuel lines here, wiring here. I've also ran the vacuum line for my boost reference to the map sensor and my ECU through there. And what that does, it just provides you with this level of organization underneath your intake manifold. So you don't have just, you know, a string of wires run into every sensor that maybe breaks apart over here on the fender. Everything's pretty organized. So you're going to notice right here, see that ginormous metal bracket hanging off the side of my intake manifold? So that is for my throttle cable. When you go to a Turbo 2 style, you can actually flip the throttle clasps or the throttle levers right here around backwards on your throttle body so that you can pull from the bottom instead of pulling from the top. A Turbo 2 typically has this super long throttle cable that routes all the way around and goes to the driver's side. So you can run the long one, or I've got like a Mr. Gasket universal throttle cable. That's what I run, and I made this bracket. Whoop. And I made this bracket right here to help hold the intake manifold, mounts to the block, holds my throttle cable. Super strong. You don't want a throttle cable bracket that bends because then you're not going to be able to get 100% TPS when you mash the loud pedal. It's just going to bend your throttle cable bracket, and that's not the move. One thing to note, guys, when you're putting these intake manifolds on, I did this on my old FC once, is you can get things stuck under this manifold that will prevent it from sitting all the way flush right here on the intake manifold itself, the lower intake to upper intake. And if you over tighten these and it's jamming down on something like a rat's nest or that whole nightmare of hoses and wires, you can actually break your lower intake manifold because you're going to tweak and crack off one of the ears. So I actually broke one of my lower intake manifolds on my FC doing that. So just make sure when you do set this on here that you can kind of over center it down and you don't have stuff preventing it, so that when you're going to bolt this side down, it actually is going to lift up the other side, not try to force the other side down. With the radiator in, my charge pipe's on, I want to show you guys this catch can before I show you where I'm going to mount it as well. This is the Radium Engineering Venta Atmosphere catch can. It's the bigger one that's approved for racing, different racing circuits, different stuff for the amount of capacity that you need in your catch can to be legal. In case you burn it down, you don't have a tiny one, they kind of require that. I want to show you guys this thing in more detail because I was so impressed with my Radium Engineering fuel cell that I went back to their site and bought this because I knew this was going to be a very high quality piece. I've seen catch cans from other companies installed on cars and they look nice and they do the trick, but dang, this thing, it just exceeds every expectation you could ever have about how nice a piece is. So with my routing, I opted for their fancy little banjo swivel fitting here, kind of knowing where I was going to put this deal. The dipstick is super nice. Up in here, there's a bunch of steel wool and stuff baffled, and actually your vent is around the perimeter of the top. Pulling the bottom off, super easy, tons of capacity. And then I've also got, which is not installed yet, a petcock valve for the bottom of this so that I can drain it without having to unscrew this in the car. So their bracketry, tons of different mounting options. You can specify what you need. And the base one that it comes with is super versatile. So let me show you where I'm putting this thing. Just listen to how crisp the threads are on this deal. The last little catch can I had was mounted right here as well. So using a OEM radiator, it has bracketry on it for the plastic shroud that would have went to the stock RX-7. So I'm using one of those holes. I'm going to drill another hole in my Champion aluminum radiator whenever I get it in the mail. But looking at all the pictures, it has all the same brackets that this should, as it is a OEM replacement radiator. And I'm going to use one of those. Got my radium brackets in here. This catch can is going to fit in here just like that. And the brackets that they send, it's so satisfying to slip this little catch can into them because it fits nice and tight. You can just tell the engineering is in their name for a reason, because they really think all of this stuff through. How about those fresh new catch can lines? Get fired up. All right, oil cooler time. This is a factory RX7 oil cooler, so it would have came on your 79 and 80 model RX7s. It's a very nice piece for an RX7 because it fits, well, the RX7 perfectly. I've looked at putting RX8 oil coolers in the front of an RX7. I've looked at some other aftermarket options. Ultimately, the RX7 oil coolers, well, they're just designed for it. They just fit the best, they work the best. They've got a built-in thermostat, and they're huge. So set up as like a dual pass, they feed on the same side, so it's split here. So the oil has to go down the bottom over to the top, or actually it's backwards because you feed the top of the oil cooler. But either way, fortunately for me, I went back into the storeroom. I guess y'all probably haven't seen back here in a while. So this is the place where all the clutter can happen, you know? It's 2 times the size of my old shop, but it's cluttery. So engines and eccentric shafts and my rotary truck. But back here, up in my little pallet shelves, I've got one more spare. So we got some gasoline. Gonna run it through the oil cooler, pump it out down there. Little fuel injection pump. If you watch the video cleaning all the oil out of this thing, I was pretty confident that I could run that other oil cooler after flushing it out like that. But we're resounding, you're gonna kill your engine again in the comments. And then I asked around, I'm like, let's just not risk it. We'll change the oil cooler. Can't be scratching up Calvin's nice paint. All right, I just put oil in it. Oil cooler lines are hooked up. The new oil cooler's in there. Cooling system isn't hooked up. I still got to wire up another relay for some electric fans. I've got 2 10-inch fans coming for this. They don't draw a ton of current, but for now, I think until my radiator comes in, I'm going to be running it with one big electric fan, which is the 11-inch one I have sitting over here for now, just so I can break this engine a little bit before we strap it to the dyno and basically run this thing at full kill. So it's got oil in it. I disconnected the crank angle sensor, or well, my full function engineering trigger kit. So I should be able to just crank this thing and see if it makes oil pressure. Let me make sure my oil pressure sensor's plugged in. That would have been a trip, cranking it over, no oil pressure sensor plugged in. It has been sitting for a minute, so hopefully my little baby battery is still charged. Let's see if we can get some oil pressure out of this dude, or if it just sounds terrible whenever I try to crank it, or if it even cranks at all. I didn't see any oil pressure yet. We're gonna keep cranking. Probably just crack one of my oil cooler lines and see if I got oil flowing too. That'd be another big test. Not entirely stoked. I've been cranking on this for quite a bit, enough that I've got a bigger battery hooked up to my little battery, breaking in a new set of jumper cables, you know, just melting all the insulation right off of them, first rip. But still don't have oil pressure coming to my gauge, which is still at the original port underneath the oil filter housing. So it's basically like the furthest advanced, what I'm going to say, port that I can get without teeing off of the front iron port, which is honestly where I should probably move the sensor to, so that if I lose oil pressure or monitor oil pressure at the front iron, that's going to be where the engine is at its lowest pressure versus right by the regulator, which is where it's at its highest. It'd honestly be interesting if I had another input to add another oil pressure sensor and see the difference between the front and the back of the engine. I'd like to do that on the 4-rotor. So anyways, I've got the coil plugged back in. I'm going to let this thing fire up and then see if it makes oil pressure instantaneously. And then if it doesn't, then, well, we'll investigate further. But you know, at the speed that I'm cranking this over, it's really not cranking that fast. So, you know, 250 RPM probably, maybe a little less. I've got my fan wired up too, and I pulled the relay, so it's not killing my power. So my guess is it's probably gonna fire right up. Here goes nothing. I got 80 psi oil pressure, so that's a win. Something's rattling up there though, which I'm not too stoked for. Oh, I know what it is. My V-band is loose on my exhaust. Alright, well, we got almost 80 psi oil pressure. Fuel pressure's holding solid. It's sitting here idling at 800. I call that a mad success for a 3-week rebuild of my RX-7 engine because I exploded an oil cooler line and the engine decided to eat itself alive. So I'm stoked. Oil pressure's there. Just since I filled it up and was crawling under. Let's see, do we have any oil leaks? The one big one in the middle is actually my oil pan, and it's dripping off the back of the engine. It was leaking before I even started the car. Not fired up for an oil pan leak, but I can get the oil pan off of this engine in the car super easy. I've ever seen under here. There's my oil filter right there, but the K-member goes super far forward with the engine mounting off the front cover. So plenty of room. Also super stoked. As much as I have went through and cleaned everything under the hood of this deal, once I can get this thing warm again and it can bake all the sweated horsepower off of all the stuff in here because of my exploded oil line, I'm going to be smelling burning, sweaty oil for a good bit because there was literally oil everywhere. So here's my fan. It's just zip tied in there for now, wired to come on with the key. Obviously got a little assembly lube soot baking out of this thing. Happy it fired right up. Sounds like it's running on all 6 faces. So I think that's where this video is going to end. We're going to get this thing out, take it for a rip here this afternoon. I got to go help Calvin finish up and then get the paint thrown down on Charles's blue rotary truck. So that's happening tonight. And then the following day, we'll get the RADX7 out. Hopefully it's sunny and go rip this thing and make sure everything's good. And then we'll wire the boost controller up and, you know, take it down to Ernie at Phalanx, throw it on the hub dyno, see what this thing can make. In addition to just see what this thing can make with the boost turned up. So I'm excited. As much as it's probably hard to sense the amount of emotion that I'm stoked my car is running again, I was honestly just sad I broke it in the first place and still kind of, you know, realizing the whole last 3 weeks of just struggle and effort to get this car back together. That, like, you know, I should be like, yeah, the car's running, woo, but I'm honestly just kind of exhausted. It's been a lot of late nights, and the fact that it makes oil pressure now, whew, sigh of relief. So with that, thank you guys so much for watching. Hope you guys are enjoying the videos. More videos, as many as I can get them cranked out. Just filming them and editing them up and getting them out to you guys. I hope you guys are enjoying seeing what's going on. And I hope you guys learned something. So with that, keep it rad. We'll see you in the next one. Woo woo! Man, I can't wait till next week. I really wanted to post a picture of my super sick Radium Engineering catch can and my vent lines and all the, you know, my engine back in my car. And then you look at this engine bay and you see this bunk, old, crusty radiator in here that's split apart. And I'm like, why did I ever run this old radiator in the first place? I should have just bought the other one right when I put the car together. But at some point back then, didn't have the money to buy a fancy radiator, so we just used what I had. But we'll get a fancy radiator now. And then the engine bay is going to look sick. And then y'all can just complain that I need to get rid of my blue couplers. Because I got 1 black one and 3 blue ones. So, always something. Peace, guys. Y'all didn't think I could end the video without showing you the car outside, huh? at that red little RX7. Dang, it's nice to see this thing out in the sunlight, huh? RADX7 right there. Alright, time to go shake this thing down. We'll see you in the next one. Dang, that thing is rad.